Hi everyone, this is the first of a handful of video lectures I'll be posting up this week, and what this first video is designed to do is just a handful of video lectures I'll be posting up this week, and what this first video is designed to do is just sort of get you to see evolution and revivalism and reform. So these two things are innately linked, much like we saw in the 1700s with the Enlightenment. These two things are innately linked, much like we saw in the 1700s with the Enlightenment process of revivalism and a number of market revolutions key American institutions. Process of revivalism. We're talking about this idea key American institutions. Really, what this is all about is a total transformation in the American economy. Really, what this is all about is a total transformation in the American economy. It begins a little bit before that. In the late 1700s, during the 1800s, you start to see the process of industrialization taking shape. 1700s, you start to see the process of industrialization is moving from artisanal production to handmade, which is handmade, moving from artisanal production to carving a desk out of a piece of wood, or as you can see there's some guitars behind me, woodworkers sitting down and carving a desk out of a piece of wood, or as you can see there's some guitars behind me. What's going to happen during the market revolution is that individual old processes are going to be abandoned. During the market revolution is that hyper-competitiveness processes are going to be American economy. We see a period this is all about what's going to be happening throughout within the American economy. Is that what this is all about, what's going to be happening throughout mechanized production, is that a result, people are pushing harder and harder towards mechanized production, and as a result, people are pushing harder and harder for competitiveness, is we're going to see in the agricultural sector. We're going to start to abandon the old ways of carrying out agriculture. We're going to see in the agricultural sector in which the profit is the highest, the old ways of carrying out agriculture, within the production of other goods and products, whatever it is that they're growing. From artisanal production, the production of other goods and mechanized production. We're going to see the emergence of factory, which is handmade. All of this is going to have a major emergence of on the United States. Now, all of the 1800s and it even has a more prolonged impact up until the present. Both in the 1800s and it even has a more prolonged revolution. What's happening is, essentially, workers during the market revolution, what's happening is, in terms of essentially workers in the overall economic scheme. What we're going to see is as this process in the overall economic scheme, you're going to have, what we're going to see workers are just going to become one part of the overall economic scheme. You're going to have, during artisanal production, generally what would happen is somebody would work from their home, make things by hand. Generally what would happen is somebody would sell it at a high price, make things by hand. Once the industrial process starts to sell it at a high price. What we're going to see after the market revolution kind of comes and takes shape is that what we're going to see after the market revolution kind of comes and takes shape is that the bottom rung of society. The workers themselves have now been displaced. The owner within a factory system is going to be the person who holds all of the capital. The owner within the factory system is machinery within who holds and they pay the workers and managers the actual factory. Underneath machinery within managers, and they pay the workers and managers the work, but are there to make sure you have the average labor, people who don't physically do the work, means is that the labor is now a low skill, indispensable asset to the company. Is that the labor is now a low skill, indispensable asset to our economy today. And I think that some of you can kind of see how this connects to our economy today. They don't have any skill. Worker is they're essentially going to stand at a machine and they don't have any skill and do one. They're essentially going to stand at a machine and pull a lever and do one very small facet of identical products that have been machine produced, and they fetch a really large profit. Thousands of identical products that have been machine produced, and they stretch a really large profit. There again, as I mentioned, to the American worker is paying you forward. Then ultimately, I'll fire you and get somebody else because somebody will like what I'm paying you. Can't come back. Then ultimately, I'll fire you and get somebody else because somebody will work. In fact, and you can't come back to me now as a worker and say anybody on the street can stand there and work in the fabric. I don't need you. So what this is ultimately going to do is anybody off the street can stand there and people are talking about a lot today. This is ultimately going to do is create the sort of wealth inequity that people are talking about a lot today. This is where we're starting to see America's economy separate really drastically into where you can get rid of them. Now, I don't need to worry about your safety. I don't worry about your working conditions. I don't worry about what I'm paying you or worry about your safety. I don't worry about your working conditions. I don't worry about what I'm paying you or your work. And that's the overall, because frankly, if you don't want to do it, somebody else will. There's some social and that's the overall gist economically. We're going to see that people are being there's some social outcomes in terms of where they're spending their time. We're going to see that people are being displaced production in terms of where they're spending their market revolution. Generally, what you will see that was happening people before the market revolution. If I'm a woodworker, what you will see, let's say, is that people were carving the wood for the guitar, making sure it's got the right resonance, the right pitch. I'm going to sit here hand carving the wood for the guitar, making sure it's got the right resonance, the right where I'm sitting right now, making sure that it's strung properly. But I'm doing it all from my garage, like where I'm sitting right now. I'm doing it ultimately mean that my wife would be able to come in and talk to me while I'm working. This all changes ultimately mean that my wife would be able to come in and talk to me while I'm working. What we're going to see is that now I have to get up in the morning and I go to a factory. And I'm going to be there all day long until sundown. I have to get up in the morning and I go to a factory. There's going to be some other social outcomes we're talking about as well in terms of the market revolution and social outcomes we're talking about as well in terms of the market revolution. But really what it means is it's separating me from my family. I'm no longer connected to my home. But really what it means is it's separating me from my family. I just no longer connected to my home. I go home, I go to sleep, I get up and I go to work again. I just go to work, I work all day, I go home, I go to sleep, I get up and I go to work again. Sort of disconnection from family and friends for the average American worker. Additionally, you're going to see that more and more family and friends for the average American worker. Additionally, you're going to see that more and more people working within the communal setting anymore. It becomes about what I need to do. Not really working within the communal setting anymore. It becomes about what I need to do, what I have to do to get up and go to work. So the market revolution also gives rise to the roof over my head. A situation in which the American economy is now reliant on capital. A situation in which the American economy is now reliant on capital to put themselves on the line. And so the people who rewarded the risk to exponentially larger put themselves on the line on the dollar are going to be rewarded a lot of money, and exponentially larger the laboring classes is going to start to suffer. They're going to make a lot of money, and everybody else in the laboring classes I want to keep these videos under 10 minutes. But that's what the entire thrust of this week's lecture is. I want to keep these videos under 10 minutes. Revolution, and then the entire thrust of this week's lecture comes as a response to that. Not everybody thinks that these kinds of shifts in the American economy comes as a response to that. So not everybody thinks that these kinds of shifts in the American economy are good. And that's something you'll be hearing about in these ultimately there will be a pushback against that. And that's something you'll be hearing about in these subsequent videos. This video is going to be about how the market revolution impacted the agricultural sector, transportation, and communication. So, really what we're seeing here is that as everyone is driven more towards profit, towards streamlining production so that you can make the most profit, the agricultural sector is going to have some key shifts happening in it here as well. So first, there are some regional breakdowns that we can outline about what's happening in the agricultural sector. During the market revolution, regions start to specialize. Up in the Northeast, they're not very good at agriculture in terms of their soil's not good for it, the weather's not good for it. So ultimately, the Northeast is going to start to focus on rearing livestock and raising things like pigs, chickens, goats, those types of things that you can eat. Now, the area that we're in right here in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, those areas at a later point in the 19th century will start actually engaging in cattle raising at a really heavy rate. And it's really not until that industry develops later in the 19th century that you see beef becoming a major part of the American diet. But within agriculture, just like everyone else, they're going to be using new devices and new technologies to streamline their production, to maximize their crop output. And so up in the Northeast, they're focusing on livestock and rearing them, whereas in the Midwest, they're going to become the grain basket of the United States, sort of the bread basket. It's really where most of the staple crops and foods that people eat are going to be produced. And so they're working on growing things like wheat, oats, any kind of basic food product that you turn into bread. And so that's where they're going to start to specialize. The South is going to pick its own specialty. They're going to start to focus far more heavily on slave-produced cash crops. And so really, there's a number of technologies that I listed out for you in the PowerPoint presentation, just sort of when they were designed and who invented them. But the most important out of all of those inventions, and the one I can promise you will pop up on an exam, is the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney. This is invented in the end of the 1700s, but it's not patented until 1807. That's when it goes into wide use on American plantations in the South. Now, the cotton gin, I don't want to get too bogged down in the technicalities of it, but what it does is to actually get the usable part of cotton off of the crop is a very labor-intensive part of the process. And so to go and hand-pick the little ball of cotton off of the cotton stalk is the most labor-intensive part of cotton production. So Eli Whitney creates a wheel that will automatically, as you spin it, separate the usable cotton away from the stalk. Now, this might not seem like such a big deal to you. You might be saying, if I see that as a term ID, what would be the importance? The importance of this is that, very simply put, it's going to prolong slavery in American society. Coming up to this point in the early 1800s, generally what you're seeing here is that the cotton gin is going to reinvigorate what looked to be a dying institution of slavery. Simply put, slavery wasn't that profitable coming into the early 1800s. But when Eli Whitney and his invention of the cotton gin comes along, it makes it so that if we take it before the invention of the cotton gin, a single slave could produce 1 pound of usable cotton a day. After the invention of the cotton gin, that same slave can now produce 50 pounds of usable cotton a day. And then what it does is it reinvigorates and makes the slave production aspect of America's economy very, very vital, very crucial, and very profitable. And so really, when you're looking at the invention of the cotton gin, what it does is it prolongs any hopes you saw of having slavery abolished during the early 1800s. And it really did look as if it were going that way. Those are now gone. America is going to shift gears and really start to rely on the cotton agriculture of the American South. And of course, that agriculture is being carried out by slaves. Now, generally speaking, across the entire nation, what we're seeing is farmers are moving from subsistence agriculture, so producing enough for themselves and their families, towards what we call commercial or surplus farming, meaning that they're trying to produce as much as possible so they can sell it in the markets and make the highest amount of profit. And so that's what people are trying to do. But this requires two different advances to go along with it. And that's why I mentioned this all in the same video. We're talking about agriculture, transportation, and communication. Now, it's great if I can grow a whole bunch of, we'll say, wheat, and I want to move it from my house in the Midwest out to the East Coast markets where most of this is being sold. I have to have accessible transportation. And so what you're going to see developing right alongside these changes in agriculture is expanding roadways. America actually starts funding what's known as the National Road in the early 1800s. They're trying to make this road that will go all the way from the East Coast, namely Maryland at that point in time, and they want to connect it all the way up with the Mississippi River in the Midwest, America's breadbasket. This is so that people and products can be easily moved from one area to another. Another crucial invention is the steamboat engine. This really gets perfected around 1807, the same time that the cotton gin was patented. And what this allows people to do is turn America's rivers into two-way freeway systems. Up until that point, it'd be easy to go down the Mississippi if you're coming from the Midwest. You can get down to New Orleans pretty easily. You're just going to float with the current. But it'd be hard to go up the Mississippi against the current. When you're traveling by steam engine, this really doesn't matter. You can go either way on these rivers, and so basically turns them into super freeways of commerce. In addition to that, in the north, we're seeing that the transportation system is starting to rely more on train when we're looking at distance travel. The north is building out railway systems. The south, they're limiting their building of railways. They're pretty much just connecting the plantations to the markets. Whereas railways are going to start cropping up all over the north. They become a key component of northern life. So you're going to see canals, roads, railways. They're all growing in conjunction with this growing push for profit. And right alongside that, if I'm going to grow my product in Michigan and I want to take it out and sell it in New York, I don't want to load up a cart with all my products and then trek it on out to the East Coast just to find out nobody's buying it. So this is ultimately going to necessitate sort of a greater level of communication happening quickly. So we're going to see post office start to explode right alongside the railway systems. In addition to that way, you're seeing a letter move at a much higher rate of speed. I could write someone out in New York, what is corn selling for right now? Or what's wheat look like in the markets out there? So before I load all my stuff up, I'm going to make sure that someone in New York tells me, yeah, they're going to be buying it when you get here. You're going to make money on this endeavor. And so, in addition to that, we're going to see the emergence of a really critical invention, the telegraph machine. Now, this machine is basically going to use electrical wires to send coded messages. It's a series. The entire English alphabet will be converted into dots and lines. And there's a little trigger, and you press dot, 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 line, line, dot, dot, line. And when that comes through on the other end of the telegraph machine, somebody can decode the message and figure out what you're asking. Generally speaking, it's going to be, what is the price of corn in New York? End. And so that's what they're doing in order to sort of revamp their communication. People need to move more readily. Products need to move more readily. So information needs to move along with it. In addition to this, we're going to see an explosion in publication. Printing becomes cheaper and more accessible to the common man. This is going to open up the rate of literacy in the United States exponentially. More and more people are going to learn to read because written materials and printed materials are far more widely available in the early 1800s. For those people who can't read, and that is a large proportion of the American public, you have Nathaniel Courier producing these colored lithograph images. They're telling you stories about American history or American contemporary life. One of his favorite subjects that you can see examples of in the PowerPoint presentation is life on the Western frontier. So if I'm an illiterate person living on the East Coast, I can pick up one of these images and get a good idea of what life looks like out on the Western frontier. So again, just to reiterate, this idea of greater production in agriculture means that we need to have better integration of people and products by transportation and better communication across the United States. Thanks. Okay, now that we've dealt with the market revolution generally, with changes in agriculture, we need to focus on industrialization and urbanization. This is a major outcome of this time period. It's during the 1800s that we start to see America's biggest cities taking shape, and it's driven by a number of demographics coming in. But industrialization, we can kind of pinpoint the factory system as going back to a guy named Samuel Slater. He starts experimenting with containing all facets of production. He's a Rhode Island merchant. He wants to put all the facets of production for cotton into one place. And so what he's trying to do ultimately is streamline the process of production so that you can make a greater profit. You're not wasting time, you're producing more. It's all in line with this general thrust of the market revolution. Shortly after Slater's kind of idea of putting this factory assembly line system into place, a number of merchants from Massachusetts are going to start opening up mill towns in New England. Basically what they're doing is they're building cotton factories on the rivers of New England, and those rivers are going to power the machinery within the factory. And generally what they're focused on is cotton production. So really, you can read about the Waltham system and Lowell experiment in the PowerPoint in the textbook for this week, but we're going to focus a little bit on the Lowell mills. This is an interesting process of industrialization and an interesting process of urbanization for us to focus on. What you have happening here is ultimately they open up these mill towns, and textile production is generally something that was seen as the role of women within society. So what they're going to do is they start building these factories along the river, and they build a railroad right by them. And the idea is that they want raw cotton to come in from the south. You get this raw cotton shipment moving up. When it comes into one of these mill towns like Lowell, Massachusetts, then It will be unloaded from the train, and by the time that you're done running it through all of the factories in Lowell, Massachusetts, you're going to have a usable shirt like the ones we wear all the time. You'll have a cotton product that's done. So what it's meant to do is contain all facets of production into this single town in Lowell, Massachusetts. Now, the people who set up this economic scheme, they also realize that they want their workers to be very close to the factory. And so they start building lodging for them as well. So this is really what we call a factory town, and it's one unique process of urbanization. In Lowell, what you have happening is women start coming from rural areas all around the country and clustering into these factory towns in Massachusetts, in particular in Lowell, Massachusetts, where they set up this first experiment. And so what they're doing is they're coming there and working with this cotton in these factories all day long. Now, this is a unique process of urbanization because it's generally geared towards women, and they're all coming to this one area just to produce cotton. We're going to see a different type of industrialism and urbanization happening in the bigger cities of the East Coast. But these women are coming from very small rural areas, and it gives them a unique opportunity to interact with people they never would have met otherwise from different parts of the country. There's a much higher level of culture in these mill towns than there was in some small rural town, wherever they might have come from. But there's a trade-off here. The conditions in these factories are atrocious. You're working about 13-hour days inside of these factories. It's dusty, it's hot, you're breathing in the byproduct of this cotton production. The windows and ventilation systems are not very good. And generally speaking, it's just horrible working conditions. And so what you're going to see is that the women in Lowell start to say, you know, this isn't working for us. This really isn't a great lifestyle to live. It's really hard work in these factories. And when they start to complain about it, it becomes very clear that the factory owners can easily get rid of one or two complainers. But what they can't do is get rid of their entire workforce at one time, otherwise production stops. And so in response to the way that the Lowell experiment is set up, we see the Lowell workers strike in the early 1830s. These women actually bound together and they say, you can fire a few of us, but you can't fire all of us. And they go on strike and they bring the factories to a standstill, after which some of their demands for working conditions changing are going to be met. And so generally speaking, we can say that this is definitely the first instance of labor organization that we're seeing across the United States under this new economic setup of the market revolution. So that sort of gives you an idea of what's happening in terms of the earliest attempts to urbanize and industrialize. But we have a totally different process going on in the big cities of the Northeast, places like New York, Boston, Providence, Philadelphia. These cities are undergoing a far more diverse economic industrialization process. They're not just producing cotton. It's not about just bring in cotton, ship out a shirt. They're producing everything: paint, chemicals, furniture, tools, instruments, you name it, it's being produced in these big cities. And they're using a combination of mechanized production, so big machines, steam-powered machines. Skilled artisans are still very much a thing in the big cities of the East Coast. And they're going to use low-skilled labor to run the machines for the mechanized portion of production. And so what you're seeing happening here is that this is going to draw a lot of people into the cities of the Northeast in the United States. The job opportunities are there. With mechanized production, you're taking out the need for a lot of skilled labor, but you do need a lot of labor. And so people are coming from all over the United States and clustering into these cities on the East Coast. Very quickly, almost overnight, you start to see what were once small walking cities turn into big urban metropolises. You're having lots of different people coming in, lots of different influences, a lot of culture, a lot of art are starting to emerge in these cities as well. But alongside this process of urbanization, you're seeing some very negative drawbacks coming as well. You start to see the emergence of crime, heavy pollution, prostitution. These are all major problems in the East Coast cities because you have millions of people working there, but you might only have 890,000 jobs available at any one time. And so you still have a lot of unemployed, a lot of homeless people. Poverty and homelessness is a huge problem in the 19th century cities in America. And this is really going to sort of drive a process in which the governments of these cities are going to have to start trying to address issues like prostitution, like petty crime and property theft, like armed robbery, like pollution, and trying to create green spaces, and so that people don't feel so confined to this sort of urban jungle. But it is important to understand this relationship. Without industrialization, that process of urbanization really doesn't take place in these East Coast cities. A good sort of example of this problem and the relationship between industrialization and urban problems like prostitution, we look at New York. In New York, they were very big in the textile industry, but up before the market revolution and industrialization, they generally specialized in making slave clothing. They'd take raw cotton from the South, turn it into some cheap rags, and send it back down to the South for resale. After the market revolution sort of takes shape, they abandon that, and clothing production becomes their number one industry. They're going to start making clothing for elites, really nice stuff that will rival what's being made in Paris and London. And so they become a city of high fashion during this time as well. And what you're tending to see as a result of this is what sort of cements New York as America's fashion capital. But you're also seeing a large number of young women coming into the city and a large number of working age males, unmarried usually, and that gives rise to this problem of prostitution. By 1850, prostitution was the second biggest industry in New York City behind textile production. So that shows you how big this problem has become. And that's going to force New York City to institutionalize the nation's first police force, a professional police force. And so you can see that a lot of these social changes are coming right alongside these economic changes that are happening during the time period. So that's my short spiel on industrialization and urbanization during the market revolution. Okay, so for this particular little mini lecture that we're talking about here, I want to focus on the populations of these growing East Coast cities that I was talking about, places like New York, Boston, Providence, Philly. What you're tending to see is that the invention of the steam engine doesn't just start making America's rivers more easily navigable. It also is going to make transatlantic travel quite a bit cheaper and more accessible to the common person over in Europe. So when America's cities start to industrialize, a lot of Europe's population is going to start coming across the Atlantic because they can now afford to travel on these steamboats, and the journey's quite a bit quicker too, so it's not as hard to get across the Atlantic. But they're going to start pouring into the East Coast cities. By the end of the 1800s, millions upon millions, somewhere in the range of 20 to 25 million European migrants, simply just from Ireland and Germany alone, have poured over into the United States cities. And so immigration starts to become a major facet of who is really starting to populate and grow these East Coast cities. And so the Irish are really probably the most prominent group that you're seeing coming over during this time period, and then right behind them you have the Germans. Now, everybody from Europe is moving for a different reason. The Irish are a pretty good example of what's happening in Europe that's causing this kind of migration. So Ireland is a colony of England. It's not an independent nation at this point. And because of that, they are being forced by the British Empire to grow potatoes. Potatoes aren't particularly nutritious, but they are very filling. And so it's a food that's commonly used to feed a very rapidly growing British Empire. And London is undergoing the same sort of industrial process as the cities on the East Coast of the United States. So a lot of people are needing to be fed because these populations are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So Ireland is not wanting to grow potatoes, they're being forced to grow potatoes. In 1845, a potato famine is going to occur. A blight will come across and destroy the crop in Ireland, the potato crop, and they can't just go, well, we can't grow potatoes anymore, let's plant something else, cabbage or some other food product. They're still being forced by the British to grow potatoes. So people are starving and dying by the millions in Ireland. So because this transatlantic travel has become cheaper, they would save up whatever they could and bring pretty much just the clothes on their back, and they would pile into these boats and start looking for new economic opportunities working in factories in America's East Coast cities. And so this is really what's going to rapidly drive up the populations of these East Coast cities. The Germans are moving for a slightly different reason, and their settlement patterns change here in America based on that. The Germans are farmers as well, but they're not being forced into farming. Most of the people who are coming to the U.S. are coming from southern Germany. It's an area called Bavaria. They want to be farmers, but a northern-run government in this region is telling them that they can't really spread out and take access to more arable lands. They don't like this, so they're going to get on boats and move over, generally with a little bit more than the Irish had when they were coming over. But when they move here, they don't want to stay in those East Coast cities. They're looking to get out of those cities as quickly as possible. So you start to see large populations of German people moving into the Midwest and then also down here into the American South, because it provides the more rural lifestyle they desire. The Irish are being forced to farm. They don't really want to live on farms anymore, so they tend to stick in those East Coast cities. That's why you see high populations of Irish people in Boston and in New York. So ultimately, they're going to start to cluster into these cities, and that's what gives rise to this idea of the melting pot in American history. But that's a bit of a misnomer. People are not really melding together and living in harmony. Generally speaking, what you're seeing is that the different ethnic groups that are traveling over from Europe, freed African Americans who are moving into the cities of the Northeast, other rural people or people from other parts of America, white people who are moving into those cities, they're not really blending together, like melting together. They're generally staying apart in their own little neighborhoods. And this is what actually gives rise to a very common term in the English language that we hear used all the time, ghetto. This is actually applied to the Lower East Side of Manhattan in New York City. It's actually taken from way back in the 1400s, when the large Jewish populations of Italy used to live around the foundry, or in Italian, the ghetto. That's what the il ghetto means, foundry in Italian. So when a large number of Jewish migrants moved over from Central and Eastern Europe, trying to flee anti-Semitism in the 1800s, they started clustering on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and that's the area that they would start in American history referring to as the ghetto. But then you also had the Five Points neighborhood, and Hell's Kitchen was largely Irish. You would walk down one street, and it would be freed African American people living in the city. You would go down to the next street, and you'd hear people speaking German or Yiddish. You go to another street, they'd be speaking Irish English, with the accent of the Irish, or they'd be speaking Gaelic. So they weren't really melting pots. They didn't really blend together all that well. But everybody is pouring into these cities. Black people, white people, European people, they're all coming for economic opportunity. And this is going to give rise to a lot of ethnic, racial, and religious tension as we see these different groups getting together and competing for jobs in the American cities. Generally, what you see happening here is the Irish and the African Americans a lot of times are fighting for the same economic opportunities, for the same jobs. And the factory owners tend to pit them against one another. They'll say, well, the African Americans are going to work for $1.50 a day, and you Irish want $2, so we're not employing you anymore. This creates a lot of tension between Irish people and African American people when they're out in the streets. Another major issue we're going to see with this process of immigration is that hundreds of thousands of Catholics are now moving into what is at that time considered to be Protestant America. And this is not taken very easily by the American people. By native-born American people, they don't want more Catholics in their country. But the Irish are almost entirely Catholic. The Southern Germans, the Bavarians, they are largely Catholic. They have a few other denominations in there as well. But they're Catholic, and this starts to change the religious landscape of these cities. And when you couple that with the growing problems like crime, poverty, homelessness, prostitution, the nativist or native-born American people start to blame these problems solely on immigration. And so In addition to racial riots, ethnic tensions, there's religious tension here as well. They're going to start to see Catholics and these Catholic migrants and migrants in general as being a major blight on American society, a huge problem. And so, I always try to correct people when I hear them say, America is a country of immigrants. That is an entirely true statement. Nobody can argue with that. It has always been a country of immigrants. But what's really also, that's kind of stopping short of the real lived reality for people. In the 19th century, these immigrants who are coming over and flooding into the East Coast cities are not met with open arms. They're met with extreme discrimination, extreme prejudice. The Irish are viewed as being subhumans to Anglo-Saxon people because they're Celtic, they're of a different ethnicity, but also because they're Catholics and they're of a different religion. And so this is starting to create a lot of tension. So as long and as old as our tradition of immigration is here in America, you also have an equally long tradition of prejudice and discrimination against migrants who are coming in great numbers. And it's important to keep that in mind, that we see the target of this prejudice changes depending on which group is coming in. As we get a little further into history, you're going to into the 19th century, you see large numbers of Chinese people starting to come in and Asians coming into the West Coast. They're met with extreme prejudice. Europeans who are Caucasians, it's not necessarily race-based. They don't like the Caucasians who are coming in either. And so they're saying the Irish are subhumans and the Germans are a bunch of drunken beer brewers, that they're undesirables. And so I just want to make very clear that when we see the population of these cities with immigrants, you're also going to see the immediate rise of what we call nativist tendencies. And that's people who don't want new immigrants coming in and changing the demographic of American society. Well, that wraps up this little mini lecture on the populations that are starting to pour into these quickly urbanizing and industrial cities. All right, now that we've heard a little bit about the market revolution, we've talked about industrialization, urbanization, changes in the agricultural sector, transportation, generally the overall economic change in the United States, it's time to start looking at how some people are reacting to these changes of the market revolution. This is not a whole lot different than what we've already encountered with the Enlightenment and the First Great Awakening. Knowing that religious revival of the First Great Awakening was in response to the pressures that the Enlightenment era thinkers kind of put on religious tenets of the time. The same thing will be happening here at the Second Great Awakening and a series of other secular reforms. They're meant to address a lot of the problems that are incumbent with industrialization, urbanization, and this drive for profit in the market revolution. So, what we're generally talking about here is that with the market revolution, the new attitude in America is not about, I need to grow enough food as a farmer to feed myself. It's about, I need to grow more than the guy next to me, outcompete him, take his share of the market, and make as much profit as humanly possible. If I'm a worker, if I have any sort of skill set whatsoever, I've generally been displaced and now I'm working as a low-skilled laborer within a factory. I'm getting paid very little, the working conditions are awful, and so this is leading towards this process of urbanization. People are pouring into the cities because the only place they can find work are in factories. It doesn't matter whether you have a skill or you don't, no one's really willing to pay you for that skill anymore. And so now I might have once been an accomplished woodworker, now I stand in a factory that produces wooden desks and I pull a lever all day long. I'm a low-skilled worker. This has driven me away from my family as well. I'm going to a factory for most of the day. I don't work out of my home anymore. My kid can't learn my craft. My wife doesn't get to communicate with me. I don't get to engage as a farmer in communal celebrations when we're all done harvesting. Generally what we saw when the shift from artisanal production towards factory and mechanized production took shape, it really destroys a lot of the social fabric of what existed before in the United States. If you were in a farming community, everyone harvested at the same time, then it was time to sit back, relax, enjoy the winter and ride it out based on what you grew for yourself and your family as a subsistence farmer. That has changed. Those communal sorts of celebrations have gone away. Now I don't want to stop. Even if the weather's getting bad, I have to find another way to make money, to outcompete my neighbor and get more profit than him. And so if I'm in a factory setting, generally speaking, if I'd been a skilled laborer or somebody who had a craft before, I'd produce this very expensive ornate guitar like these back here, I'd sell it for a good profit and then go, I'm done. I'm going to go to the pub, I'm going to get a drink, hang out with my buddies, go see my family more, all these kinds of things. That's all shifted with this new way of earning money in the American society. In addition to that, you have this wealth distribution has totally changed. You have the management is becoming a middle class, but the laborers are very low paid. They're underappreciated, and they're being used as pawns or tools by the factory owners, the wealthy industrialists. Those people are making millions and millions of dollars, and the person who's actually doing the heavy labor down on the ground, they're not making much of anything. They can barely feed their family. So, when you look at all this collectively, it leads to a very serious sort of social and moral crisis in America. There's this issue of religion has now been kind of pushed to the side again, just like it was after the Enlightenment. Now it's the new god is profit, and everyone's driving after it. But a number of people look at the changes that are happening in America. Families are breaking down. People are becoming corrupt and greedy. The politicians are being bought and sold by wealthy business owners. And all of this, it looks like a complete breakdown of the social fabric in the United States. And there's a number of ways that people are going to want to try and deal with this. There are people who are going to want to carry out religious reforms and start dealing with the spiritual aspect of it. And then there's other people who say this doesn't have much to do with religion or spirituality. It kind of has to do more with how our institutions in this society are sort of structured. And so what we're going to be looking at for the remainder of these mini lecture videos is just how people are responding to the market revolution. The first major shift here, and I'll cover it in this video because I do have time to talk about it, is the Second Great Awakening. This is another one of those evangelical religious revivals. And what it does is it sort of introduces the idea of born-again Christianity into the American mainstream. Now, the Second Great Awakening is generally dated as happening between 1790 and 1840. But in all earnestness, it really picks up momentum from 1820 to 1840. And again, it is a series of religious revivals. However, it's not so much happening out in the woods. Those are happening too. People are getting together for meetings. Traveling preachers are moving around and talking to communities. But they're also relying far more heavily on increased access to printing, something we talked about in one of the other lecture videos. So they're sending more pamphlets out, trying to change people's minds with the printed word because more and more Americans are becoming literate. But the main message of the Second Great Awakening is this. We have become corrupt, immoral, greedy, and disconnected from our social lives and our families, the things that, in the eyes of the revivalists, God really wants us to be connected to. And so, the figurehead of this movement is a lawyer-turned-preacher by the name of Charles Grandison Finney. He's a Presbyterian preacher, he's from Ohio, but he has a very forceful and dramatic preaching style that's very, coming from the profession of law, he's very good at persuading people towards seeing his point. But the general message behind this here is that you are not predestined to hell or heaven. And that's a lot of the religious Protestant denominations at this time, a lot of them tend to believe in this idea of predestination. You are on a path towards heaven or hell that God set for you before you're born, and there's nothing you can do to change it. The Second Great Awakening comes along and it says that's not true. If you do better in your life, you start acting right, you repent, you reform yourself, and you make the world around you a better place, then you will find spiritual salvation in the afterlife. And that's the message that Finney and the other revivalists are trying to preach. So this introduces, during this time period, this new notion of born-again Christianity. Doesn't matter what you did in the past. If you're a rapist, a murderer, a robber, a philanderer, none of that really matters. You can change your ways moving forward, and as long as you make the world around you a better place, then you will find spiritual salvation. You're not destined to heaven or hell. You can change your path. And so that's what they're really talking about in the Second Great Awakening. And it comes with a few different elements to it. It's going to be, I guess, it's taking place mostly in the Midwest and the Upper South. And what they're preaching about is they're espousing for some really particular ideas, like temperance, or the basically abstaining from alcohol. They are generally strongly in favor of abolition, and they're going to push for reform ideals like women's suffrage. Now, there's a reason for all of this. A slave can't find their own spiritual redemption if they're just working and doing what they're told to do by the slave master. They can't make the world around them a better place if they're being pigeonholed into that position. They're not given that free will to change their lives for the better and the lives of those around them. So that's why the people like Finney are strongly against slavery. He's in favor of women's suffrage, or the women's right to vote, because he says, how can women find spiritual salvation if they're not allowed to make these important political changes by way of voting around them? And then finally, he's going to say things like alcohol are preventing you, or stunning you from being able to find this spiritual morality that people need to turn to in these dire times of greed and corruption that they see happening, poverty, homelessness, crime. These are all major problems in America. And so what the Second Great Awakening is all about is finding repentance, reformation of yourself, changing the way that you act and live, and changing the society around you for the better. And so this is going to spill over from this sort of religious revivalism into the secular reforms we'll be talking about in the videos ahead. Okay, the next subject that we're going to be dealing with this week is secular reforms. And when I say secular reforms, that may be mislabeled a little bit, because there is definitely a religious underpinning to the reform of how people are engaging with alcohol in society, how people are dealing with law and authority in the penitentiary systems, because we're going to see some reforms there, the mentally ill, and with education. So those are all topics that we're going to be talking about right now in this little mini lecture video. So we're going to start with the temperance movement. Temperance is what this means. The temperance movement is coming about in the early 1800s, really picks up steam by the 1830s, and it's designed towards stopping alcohol consumption and sales in American society. It's generally going to be based on a three-pronged attack. The temperance movement leaders are going to say alcohol is not good for your mind, it's not good for your body, and it's not good for your soul. And really, the reason that they're targeting alcohol at this point in America's history is because it's grown into a huge problem. When we see all of these impoverished people moving from across the Atlantic, coming over from Europe, they're coming in with very little education. Most of them don't have any particularly acute skills, and they're entering into a workforce in which they're working in terrible conditions, awful hours, and they're still making very little money and not enough to really make ends meet. Because of these kinds of circumstances, alcohol consumption in America is skyrocketing by the 1830s. By 1830, they're drinking about twice as more than the average person drinks today in American society. It's kind of grown to an epidemic level problem. And so what they're trying to do, the temperance movement is trying to address this. And there's a lot of different strains of thought going into this, right? So there's a lot of people behind it. If I'm an industrialist, alcohol's a big problem for me. I've got guys showing up hungover or drunk to try and work with big, heavy equipment. If any of you pick up any bottle of alcohol today, it usually says in small letters on the side, do not operate heavy machinery. Well, that's what they're doing all the time in the factories back then. You got guys who are still drunk coming into work in the morning, hungover coming into work in the morning, and they're feeding materials into big, heavy equipment. Well, a little misstep, you're not paying attention, and your arm gets sucked in and ripped off by this industrial machine. These types of on-the-job accidents are happening frequently in the 1820s, 1830s, and 1840s. And so industrialists are in favor of temperance because they don't want to have to stop the production. They don't care about the guy's arm getting ripped off. They have a way to deal with that. There's the door. I don't need a one-armed worker. But what they are concerned with, they have to shut down the equipment, clean out the arm and the blood and all that stuff. This is a work stoppage. That's a problem for them. It cuts into their profit. So they're going to be fighting for temperance during this time period. Another major demographic of people who are fighting for temperance are women. Women are generally dealing with the fallout of excessive alcohol consumption that men are engaging with during this time period. Men are the ones leaving their families, going out into the workspace, whereas women are staying home in the domestic sphere. And the men are going to basically be really stressed out, really overworked at the end of the day. They go get a couple of pints, drink a little bit too much at the bar, and when they come home, they're very difficult to deal with because they're drunk. As most of you are probably well aware, there's a pretty neat correlation between alcohol consumption and domestic violence. And so you have a number of people and religious figures who are part of the revival as well are pushing for temperance because, well, it's not a sin in the Bible to drink. It never will embrace open drunkenness or acting a fool because you've been drinking too much. So you have a lot of people pushing for the sort of removal of alcohol from American society. It never does take effect on a nationwide scale during the 1800s. You start to see statewide laws and local laws dealing with alcohol consumption and sales. They're going to start prohibiting it on a more piecemeal basis. And this is successful at cutting down on the amount of drinking that's going on during this time period. But ultimately, when this whole thing sort of plays out, they're going to be successful at limiting alcohol consumption, but they're doing so in a very, very strategic way. They're saying, look, it's not good for your body. We all know that it causes cirrhosis, jaundice, failure of the liver, things like that, probably some other medical problems that I myself am not aware of. But that's obviously a medical issue. Mentally, you can't come in fit and ready to do work if you're drunk. And then finally, spiritually, it corrupts you into doing things that you generally wouldn't do if you were sober. At least that's the argument of the time period. And so they use this sort of three-pronged attack, and it helps to sort of bring drinking back under control in American society when it has become this big, big problem going along hand in hand with urbanization and industrialization. Another major reform that's going to be carried out is reform to the education system. The general model is coming out of the state of Massachusetts. There's a Whig politician there by the name of Horace Mann. He is advocating for a more streamlined public education system. Simply put, what he's arguing is we need teachers who are going to follow a set curriculum, students need to be learning from the same textbook, and we need to have the same standardized assessments and methods of testing whether or not students are grasping these concepts. So you can thank Horace Mann for the multiple choice and the essay questions and all that stuff. This is all getting formalized in the mid-1800s. So Horace Mann is saying that basically if we provide a good, strong public education system, a uniform public education system, meaning it doesn't matter whether you go to school in Houston or Katy or Austin or Laredo or El Paso, you should be getting the same education at any one of these public institutions. But the education back then doesn't really look like what we would call education today. So really the message of education back then was a little bit more in line with the economic scheme. What it was trying to teach students was, hey, we're not all going to be rich. We're not all going to get to be wealthy industrialists. So you should shut up, go to work, be happy with the job that you have because that's what God wants for you. Just smile, go to work, and do what's asked of you by your boss. And this is reinforced as well by the textbooks that they're using at the time. And when I say textbook, that's a loosely defined term. They're basically books that'll say, here's a chapter on botany, here's a chapter on history, here's one on philosophy, here's one on math. It's not like the textbook you're all using where it takes you through U.S. history from one point to another. So what we're seeing there is that students, the educational message of this time is reflecting what's happening in the economic sector, which is most of you are going to work hard and die poor. So just get used to it and be happy with it. There are a number of people who push back against these reforms that Horace Mann is trying to carry out across the national scale. Mainly they're Democrats, agriculturalists, and Catholics. So Democrats are fearing that too much power is going to be vested in the hands of the federal government if we create a uniform national public education model. Whereas the agriculturalists are saying, I can't afford to take my kid off the farm when we're harvesting, trying to make a profit here in the market revolution, and then stick him in some class where he learns about ancient philosophy. That doesn't make any sense. I need my kid working here on the farm with me. And then finally, the Catholics are fearful because the people who run the school boards, who set the curriculum, are generally Protestants. And there's a lot of heavy biblical influence in education in the 19th century. What that means is that they're learning from the King James Version of the Bible, which Catholics don't follow. And so you're seeing that there's a lot of pushback to man's ideals. Generally what you're seeing is uniform education takes place state by state, and from that point forward, state governments are going to run it. It becomes compulsory education, or meaning you have to send your kid to school for a certain number of years, the thing that the agriculturalists are fighting against. That doesn't really become a reality in American society until later in the 19th century. And again, it's generally happening in the North more so than it is in the South back in that time period. So, the last sort of reform I want to talk about in this mini lecture video is penitentiary reform and the reform to how people are treating those with mental illnesses or social illnesses. With the prisons, up until the market revolution, generally speaking, America kind of worked on a physical punishment-based system. If you stole something, we lash you and stick you up in the market square. If you killed someone, we're going to execute you. If you committed a serious offense, death is the penalty. But when you think about what's being taught in the Second Great Awakening, if you are expected to change your behavior, to change your ways and repent and reform, then ultimately we can't just go around beating people as punishment and then killing them when they do something really serious. And so what they're going to do is focus more on this element of repentance, and that's where we get the penitentiary system, the one that we still use up until this day. The whole idea behind the penitentiary system is that if you give somebody time to sit and reflect about their criminality, reflect on the mistakes they've made in their lives and how they ended up in a prison system in the first place, then generally speaking, they will change their ways and be able to re-enter society as a reformed person. Now, there are a lot of people who argue in the modern times that the system is ineffective, it doesn't work, it actually creates greater levels of criminality in people when you lump them together with a bunch of other criminals. We won't get into any of that, but what we will talk about is the design of the prison system. You have the Ossining prison system emerges in the early 1800s in New York. And generally speaking, it's a labor camp where prisoners are isolated at night to think and reflect on what it is that they've done. But that labor system is also producing a lot of the raw material that will be building the cities that are rapidly growing on the East Coast. New York City, a lot of the stone for the buildings that's being used to put on their facades, that is being dug out by prisoners at the Ossining prison system. This model of penitentiary is going to be followed more so by the South than it is by other places in the North. The North tends to follow what's known as the Eastern State System. This emerges in Pennsylvania, the eastern part of Pennsylvania, in the 1830s. This is where prisoners are locked in solitary confinement all day long, 24/7 isolation, with the idea being they're left in there with a Bible and their job is to sit and reflect on how they have made mistakes, how they haven't lived a good moral life. And hopefully when they reflect on it, they will be remorseful and ultimately be able to be rehabilitated and re-enter society when it's all said and done. So that's the idea that's sort of driving the prison system. It's tied to those ideas of the Second Great Awakening. We need to give our prisoners and our criminals a chance to repent and reform and change their lives, and maybe they can make the world around them a better place and find spiritual salvation. And so that's a model that we've carried well up into today. We still have a very bloated, in fact, the world's largest penitentiary system to date. So, amongst the penitentiary reforms, they had to deal with the issue of mental illness, because up into the 1800s, the common practice was if somebody had a mental illness, you'd just throw them into a prison or a poorhouse, which is basically a glorified prison. So a woman comes along named Dorothea Dix. She's a Massachusetts school teacher. In 1841, she starts carrying out a campaign to reform how the mentally ill are treated in the United States. She thinks that we need to sort of isolate them out from the prison population, that it's not good to have them around hardened criminals, because they're not criminals, they just have a mental illness. And so she starts advocating for the institution of insane asylums. Insane asylums are meant to house the people who have mental illnesses. We're still not at a point in American history where they're treating these illnesses, where they're not using pills or therapy or anything like that. But they are removing the prisoners, the mentally ill, from the prisoner system there and putting them in these insane asylums. And so the asylum system is going to remove the mentally ill from the prison system, but it doesn't do much for them. Their treatment isn't much better. They're basically going to be beaten when they have any sort of episode or fit, sprayed with fire hoses, locked in cages. But this is how they're removing what they think are a dangerous criminal or just a dangerous element from American society, but they're not really going about treating these people. And these asylums will remain in use in the United States until very recently. In fact, even when I was born, up into the Reagan era is when they start to see them being closed down. And then we often find that the mentally ill are going right back into the prison systems like they were in the days before the market revolution. So these are the types of reforms that people are trying to carry out during this time period. So I'm going to wrap this mini lecture video up here and start dealing with abolitionism and responses to abolitionism in the next video. All right, so going along with our conversations about reform and pushback against the market revolution in American society, obviously one of the big elephant in the room there when it comes to what needs to be fixed with American society is this idea of slavery. Slavery is still very much the prominent argument of the day. Slavery generally is going to be espoused by religious organizations in the North, saying that this is not morally right by a religious standpoint. But from there's going to be a number of arguments made to sort of deal with this idea of abolishing slavery or abolition. And generally speaking, where we start on our lecture slides this week I'm talking about a guy named David Walker. You'll probably be reading his document as you go through the documents on the signature assignment page. But what's happening here with Walker is he's an African-American guy, and in 1829, he writes a very influential pamphlet, and he's reaching out directly to the African-Americans who are living in slavery in the American South, and he says, look, we've put in more effort, blood, sweat, and tears into building this country. We've put in as much as anyone, if not more. And so really, this country is ours, and we deserve these inalienable rights and these freedoms that are being denied to us through the institution of slavery. And he gives a rise to this idea of immediatism. He says, we can't deal with slavery on this bit of piecemeal legislation. We'll pass something here to help slaves and maybe let them go over here but not over there. He says, that's all BS. That's not going to work. He says, look, we've earned our freedom in this country, and if white people don't want to give it to us, then we need to take it, and that's violently if necessary. So he's kind of advocating for slaves who are not being given their freedom to rise up in the American South and kill their slave owners and the white people around them. This is a very, very inflammatory idea. He writes this pamphlet in 1829. He dies in 1830. His career is cut short. He comes down with an illness and dies. But Walker is going to leave a lasting impact on the conversations about abolition. After Walker, you start to see more influential abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison picking up on this idea, saying, we've tried to step around and negotiate slavery for too long. What we really need to do now is just deal with it and end it. All across the United States, one fell swoop, like pulling off a Band-Aid. And this is the position that's taken by newspapers like the one he publishes, The Liberator. They're using this increased access abolitionists are to printing in order to deal with the issue of slavery and ending it in the United States. They publish about it in their newspapers and pamphlets all over the North. They send thousands upon thousands of pamphlets down to the American South, which are promptly pulled off the trains and burned in public bonfires where people are very much against the idea of abolition. But this idea of immediatism is also, it brings up another issue here. This idea of ending slavery immediately in the United States raises new problems. It is really important to understand, in the 19th century in America, believing in abolition doesn't mean you believe in racial equality. And many abolitionists felt, look, I don't agree, nobody should be held in slavery, that's not fair. But I also don't want freed African Americans living around me. I want them gone. And this is what gives rise to an organization known as the American Colonization Society. This society emerges in the early, about 1817, 1818, and it's spearheaded by some very famous politicians. It's spearheaded by guys like Madison, guys like Marshall, and Henry Clay. What's interesting about this organization is its makeup. It's made up of pro-slavery advocates and anti-slavery advocates. And here's the reasoning for it. Anybody who's anti-slavery is saying, look, slavery needs to end. We just need to do anything to get people out of slavery. Whereas the pro-slavery people are saying, even if that means putting them on a boat and sending them somewhere else around the world, it's good just to get people out of slavery. Pro-slavery people are looking at this as an opportunity as well. And they're saying there's a particular group of people they fear the most. That is freed slaves, freed African Americans. People who are living free in this country, it's hard to hold somebody in slavery and go, I'm holding you in slavery because you're inferior because of the color of your skin. Oh, never mind the guy down the road who's the same skin color, same race, but he lives free. Those people are a big threat to slave owners. Slave owners and abolitionists alike start to fund the American Colonization Society to send freed African Americans to other places around the world. In particular, they set their sights on Liberia in West Africa. The American Colonization Society sends back a group of people in the 1820s. About 1,400 freed African Americans are going to go to the west coast of Africa and found this colony known as the nation today that we now call Liberia. And so this is how they're looking to sort of deal with the slavery problem in America. We don't want to hold them as slaves anymore, but no, we don't want them living here. Many of the prominent abolitionists do not believe in racial equality the way that we do in the modern times. They don't think that blacks and whites can live side by side in the same society. So these, after some trials and tribulations, the initial group of returned African Americans going back to Africa, they're dying off of yellow fever, of hantavirus, of malaria, because they don't have any immunities. They're not from Africa. Africa was never their home. They never lived there. They were born in the United States. Their parents were probably born in the United States. And so they go back without any of the immunities, and it's really a rough go to get that colony established over there in the first place. But by the mid to late 1800s, it starts to flourish. Around 1860, you're seeing that there's about 13,000 African Americans have gone to what today we call Liberia, the nation of Liberia. But I do want to discuss this element here because they're not going to act very, very kindly towards the indigenous Africans, like the Kru, the Bassa, and the Grebo people. They go back over there, and they're basically Americans settling in Africa. They look at Africans as being inferior. They see them as godless pagans because they haven't converted to Christianity. They don't dress right because they're still wearing clothes more conducive to a tropical environment rather than wool three-piece suits like this returning group has. There's an extreme amount of prejudice from the returned African Americans towards the indigenous Africans. And so this is a group of people we call Americo-Liberians. They are going to basically be running the country of Liberia from its foundation right up into the modern day. They institute English as the official language of Liberia. They modeled their flag after the flag of the United States. They establish a capital called Monrovia, named after James Monroe. And so you can see they're establishing all of these ties to the Western world, to their American identity. And they basically treat the native Africans in this region as in the same way the American government is treating Native Americans. We're trying to expand. We're trying to civilize. If you're in our way, we're either going to push you out of the way or kill you. That's the way they're treating native Liberians. And so native Liberians don't even have an ability to engage in voting or government until after the turn of the 20th century. So there's a strong amount of prejudice from the Americo-Liberians towards the native Liberians. And so what you tend to see there is right up until the present, the names of their presidents, their politicians, their economic movers and shakers, they're all English. It's Samuels, Johnson, Sirleaf, Taylor. These are all common names over there for the Americo-Liberian group. And that's the people who have been running the country pretty much ever since, and indigenous Liberians are still kind of on the outs. So with Walker's appeal, I'm kind of backtracking here. When Walker makes this appeal in 1829, you tend to see that the American Colonization Society, this idea of supporting freeing the slaves and sending them somewhere else, it loses a lot of steam in the American South. And quite frankly, it never picked up steam amongst the African American communities here in the U.S. So basically, they don't want to go to Africa. They don't have any affiliation or affinity for Africa. They don't know anything about it. As far as they're concerned, it's the dark continent. They don't really see a connection to that place. And so the American Colonization Society, we kind of just carried through the story of Liberia there. But they have limited success. The vast majority of people are not going to take part in this resettlement effort. In the South, after Walker's appeal, they're very, very angry with the North and with people like Walker. They're saying basically you're supporting this guy who says if you don't believe in slavery or you're being enslaved in the United States, you should just rise up and kill your slave owners. You're espousing violence against us here in the South. And so they themselves start to try to come up with their own justifications for slavery. They're going to start talking about how it's good for the mental, physical, and spiritual well-being of their slaves and for the masters alike. The masters learn how to work with people, they learn how to operate a workforce, and obviously they're making a whole lot of money off of cotton production. But in addition to that, they're saying it's good for the slaves. The slaves love us like family. And that's what they call the peculiar institution. This is a very strange sort of thing to us here in the modern times. But what the Southerners are saying is, our slaves love us, and they wouldn't know what to do without us. And without us, they'd be in poverty on the streets. They don't have any land. They don't have any resources. They don't have anything. And so if we don't take care of them and treat them like our children, yeah, we make them work for us. We'll overlook that for a few minutes. But they really do look up to us as people who are civilizing. We teach them to honor the flag, to honor Christianity, to wear Western styles of clothing. We're civilizing this group of people. And it's good for them, and we happen to make a little money on the side. And so that's what they call the peculiar institution. And they use this to try to justify slavery. And they go a step further and they say, look at our slaves. They don't live on the streets with no work. We put them to work. We use them where we need them. We feed them. We clothe them. We put a roof over their head. When we look at those factory workers who are dying in poverty on the streets in New York and Boston, the South is making the argument, we don't do that to our slaves. We treat our slaves better than you treat your free white laborers. And so these are the ways that they're trying to justify continuing on in slavery when you're hearing a much louder voice calling for the immediate end of the institution in the middle of the 1800s during the market revolution. All right, we have made it to the final short mini video lecture for this week, kind of wrapping up our discussions on the market revolution and revival and reform and all these other things. And the last subject we're dealing with today, or this week, I should say, since we're online now. Well, ultimately, it's going to be the burgeoning sort of women's movement and the women's liberation movement. And so what you're going to see is that this is also in response to a lot of these changing circumstances in America. What you're tending to see happening here is that there's a lot of sort of correlation between the treatment of women in American society and this ongoing discussion about the morality of slavery and African Americans living as second-class citizens in America. But it also is very much tied into this idea of the market revolution generally. Because what starts to happen when the market revolution takes off is all these social changes. The man gets up and goes to work in the factory. And what that does is it drives a wedge between men and women in American society. What we start to see in America is that women are seen as being within the domestic sphere entirely, and men are out in the public sphere, out in the economic sphere, in the competitive sphere. And so it really entrenches these ideas about what it means to be an American man or an American woman. Really, we start to see men become more associated with aggressiveness, with competition, with to be an American man is to beat the brains in of the other guy, take his stuff, and be like kind of caveman style almost, where it's your job to go out there, be competitive, fight for the profit, beat everybody else out, and win. Whereas with women, they're expected now, not only have they been sort of resigned into the domestic sphere, but they're expected to be the exact opposite of what it means to be a man. They're supposed to be docile, quiet. They're supposed to be sort of dainty and unwilling to raise their voice. It really starts to sort of pigeonhole women into this very, very patriarchal role that we've long seen them in American society. And so it further entrenches this idea of men are out there beating, killing, stealing, doing whatever it is they have to do to turn a profit and take care of the family. And women are at home raising the kids, being sweet and listening to their husbands. So this is a reality for middle and upper class white women really only. This is very demographically specific. And so what you're tending to see is that for immigrant women, for African American women, for poor women in agricultural and rural areas or in the cities, they're expected to go out and work in factories, work in the fields. They're doing everything they've always done, all the hard labor, the heavy lifting, all the things that we tend to associate with being the man's job in society. Whereas the middle class and upper class white women form what they call the cult of true motherhood. What this is really all about is it's an attempt to sort of define a woman's position in American society and American womanhood by describing the realities of middle and upper class women. That they are to stay at home, they are to be quiet, they are to be chaste and docile, in control of their emotions at all time. It's okay for a guy to have an angry outburst and blow up, but it's not okay for a woman. And so you're seeing that this is all growing hand in hand. I love to point out these patterns of cause and effect. And this has a really lasting impact on American society because it's not really, these perceptions don't really start to change until well after World War II, with the really strong emphasis of the 1960s and 70s on a true women's liberation movement. What we're seeing in the 1800s is largely just a precursor to that. Women are sort of, some elements of them are going along and saying, yes, this is what it means to be an American woman, but no, that doesn't mean we give in entirely to this patriarchal system. That's not really what it's all about. That there needs to be some element of women having equal access. The right to vote is really the big one. The issue of women's suffrage comes onto the table in the mid-1800s. It's not something that's going to gain a whole lot of traction until after the Civil War. And the reason for that, and the reason we're only going to talk about women's rights here briefly, is because you don't really see a full-scale women's rights movement until after the Civil War and after the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, guaranteeing African Americans citizenship and voting rights. Generally speaking, this is kind of like a blip on the radar or a small wave kind of comes and goes. But we have the Seneca Falls Convention taking place in 1848, and this is a monumental point in women's history because this is the first time that American women and men, there are men in attendance at this conference as well, but women's leaders get together and start talking about their position in American society, their position underneath these patriarchies. And what they're starting to do is challenge them. They become a backbone of the abolitionist movement. They're really, really in favor, women are, of liberating African Americans from slavery because they have some symbiosis, some feeling of similarity in the positions that they live in. And they start to challenge these things. At the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, it's held in Rochester, New York, people who are in line of thinking that women need to start challenging their position in society as well, they get together and start discussing the major issues that face women in this time period. And of course, women's suffrage is the biggest one, the right of women to vote on a national scale. And it's also interesting that it goes back and is part of our reform movement and our revivalist movement of the Second Great Awakening, that women need to be able to take a more active role in public society. So the Seneca Falls Convention ends with something known as the Declaration of Sentiments and Independence. And what it is it models itself off of the Declaration of Independence. But what it's really all about is it just kind of throws in that men and women are created equal. This declaration is meant to explain that women should have the same rights as men and not live as second-class citizens in their own society. Now, after the Seneca Falls Convention, there's about 12 more conventions just like it that pop up all over the United States. Like I said, it's sort of a brief but notable watershed moment for women's rights in the United States. But ultimately, it fails to gain any wide traction or momentum at this time. And that's simply because slavery is the more pressing issue on a national scale. It's what women and men are concerned with slavery. Slavery impacts African American women and men. And so with the country about to rip itself apart in the midst of the 19th century, building up to the Civil War, women's rights is an issue that kind of gets tabled for the time being. Women's rights leaders actually say, it's not the time for us to push for this, because if we do, people are going to lose sight on the issue of slavery. They're not going to deal with this issue of slavery. And you have to take into account who's voting back then. Who's voting on any of these issues? It's white males. They're the ones voting. You might be able to convince them to allow African American men to come in and vote. You might be able to convince them to allow women to come in and vote. But if you throw all this change on them at the same time, the women's rights leaders know there's going to be a strong pushback to this, and they're not going to achieve what they want, nor will African Americans be liberated from slavery or be given equal citizenship rights after the Civil War. So that's where you tend to see this thing kind of fizzling out, and then it will pick up again at the end of the 19th century, and women will gain real actual voting rights on a national scale in 1919 and 1920 with the suffrage movement, women's suffragist movement. That's something that sort of develops after World War I. So that's generally speaking what you're seeing going on here with the Seneca Falls Convention, but it's an important moment in the history of women in the United States, that it shows us how acutely aware they are, that they are not being treated equally either, and that it's that time for them to stand up and start trying to seize some of their rights. Even if it wasn't as successful as many of them have hoped, it did at least get the ball rolling about these discussions so that they could revisit it at a later date in American history and start making some real impactful changes. So that wraps up all my discussions for this week in the video lectures. I'm trying to keep them brief and kind of informal for right now, as I know we're still undergoing this transition to online. It's a bit of a difficult process. But you can expect to see more videos like this in the coming weeks. Please make sure you're looking at the PowerPoint slides because it has a lot more detail. You'll see the bolded words are still the ones most likely to show up on exams. Unfortunately, my wife and pets will get a little bit upset if I just start shouting words like you need to know it for the exam. But make sure you're doing the readings as well, because the textbook is covering a lot of this stuff, and it's going to give you that good sense of the chronology that you might not be able to get out of these short, snipped video lectures. So, as usual, if you have any questions, any concerns, comments, demagoguery, or diatribe, feel free to drop me an email, and we can even set up Zoom sessions if you wanted to talk face to face, whatever that might be in these days of social distancing. I hope you're all doing well out there, staying healthy, and my best wishes to you and your families. Bye.